For the first time, we're hearing what's reported to be Officer Darren Wilson's version of what happened on the day he shot and killed Michael Brown. The New York Times published the following account of what Officer Wilson told investigators. The Times says he was, quote, pinned in his vehicle and in fear for his life during a struggle with Michael Brown. Officer Wilson told authorities the gun was fired twice inside the car, with the first shot hitting Michael Brown in the arm. FBI forensic tests reportedly backed this up. The Times says Michael's blood was found on the gun as well as on the interior door panel and on Officer Wilson's uniform. But this new account could raise more questions than answers. For example, the Times says it does not explain why, after he emerged from his vehicle, he fired at Mr. Brown multiple times. And that central point has been repeatedly raised by other witnesses to the shooting.
As I get closer is when I see them tussling through the window. Like the kid was pulling off and the cop was like pulling in. The first gunshot came from the window, so like I could start getting out the way because the shots just came after that.
He's running this way. He turns his body towards this way, hands in the air, being compliant. He gets shot in his face and chest and goes down and dies.
That shot struck my friend in the back. He then stopped what he was going and stopped to turn around with his hands in the air.
Michael's body jerks as if he was hit. Then he turns around and he put his hands up, and the officer continued to walk up on him and shoot him until he goes all the way down to the ground.
It's been exactly 2 months since the grand jury began hearing evidence, and these are the conflicting accounts those jurors are weighing right now as they decide whether to bring charges against Officer Wilson. Joining me now is former U.S. Attorney Kendall Coffee and Liz Brown, attorney and columnist for the St. Louis American. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Reverend.
Thanks, Reverend.
Kendall, what questions do you have tonight about Officer Wilson's account?
Well, I think his account is something that if a grand jury hears it and they're not getting any leadership, any explanation from the prosecutors, they might think it makes him look less like he committed a crime because there was a physical confrontation inside the car. But if there were prosecution leadership, this could support a theory of the prosecution that there was a physical encounter, the officer was angry, and that the shooting victim, from the standpoint of the family of Michael Brown, was trying to leave, trying to surrender, and he shot him because he was still acting out of an anger that was precipitated by the confrontation. That would support a prosecution theory of a crime if the prosecution were presenting such a theory to the grand jury. But we see no indication that that's what the prosecution, the local prosecution, is trying to do here at all.
So that isn't really the problem that many people, including me, have raised, that you need an outside prosecutor that's more objective, that is really comes down to whether or not people have confidence in this prosecutor, and the family of Michael Brown and others have questioned this prosecutor from day one.
It's been raised many times, but the reality is it's still the same county prosecuting attorney, McCullough, and there has been no indications that this grand jury is moving toward prosecution. And a grand jury without direction is not a grand jury that's going to lead to prosecution.
Liz, just 2 days after the shooting, the young man who was with Michael Brown during the shooting described what he said happened. Listen.
The officer then reached out and he grabbed his arm to pull him into the car. So now it's like the officer's pulling him inside the car and he's trying to pull away. He said, "I'll shoot you," or "I'm going to shoot." And in the same moment, the first shot went off. And we looked at him, he was shot, and there was blood coming from him, and we took off running.
So that witness agrees that Brown was shot during a scuffle at the car, but he disagrees with the later testimony given by Officer Wilson. Does this comes down to who the jury believes, Liz?
Well, First of all, we don't know that that witness has testified in front of the grand jury first. Right. And secondly, that what we can also take from this witness's testimony is that his statement was made contemporaneously around the same time of the incident. Darren Wilson waited 4+ weeks before he walked into a grand jury. That's a long time to gather the statements, to go over the statements, and as Kendall and I both know, memories are not like wine. They don't get better with age. A contemporaneous statement made at the time around the incident is more credible by law and by life experience. So we know that, and there's another fact that I don't think that people are very aware of. We found out recently that one of the prosecutors in this grand jury case is a former police officer. And that, again, adds to the notion that...
One of the prosecutors in this case with the local prosecutor?
That is correct.
Was a former police officer.
That is correct. So how are we going to get a fair and impartial assessment presentation of this case? And if Darren Wilson went into that grand jury first and presented all of his testimony first, then all other evidence, the evidence that comes next is going to be trying to disprove what Darren Wilson said.
Now, Kendall, is it also of interest to you, you've been a prosecutor, that the other shots that was fired on Michael Brown, he was some distance from the car? Shouldn't Darren Wilson have to account for if he was shot in the car? How does he explain Darren Wilson? How does Darren Wilson explain Michael Brown, the other shots had him so far away from the car?
And that really becomes the critical part of any prosecution theory. Okay, whatever happened in the car happened. But when somebody departs and there's a separation, the officer is no longer in peril, especially if that somebody is trying to surrender, hands up, as several independent witnesses have pointed out, as Liz pointed out, was stated spontaneously by a completely independent witness, then you've got plenty of stuff to work with if there is a will on the part of the prosecutor to take a serious look at that evidence.
The fact that we are looking at the fact, Liz, that police have leeway if they're facing deadly force, would it also be of interest to a fair jury, fair and impartial grand jury, that they would want to know if he was in fear? Did he call in for backup once Brown was no longer in the car? Was this reported? I mean, wouldn't all of these questions have to be raised?
Absolutely, and there also has to be testimony about the circumstances that led Darren Wilson to speak to Michael Brown to begin with. And they also need to know about the history of police officers and the African-American males within that community, because all of those answers, all of that information gives us insight into what caused that officer to stop Michael Brown to begin with. And then his subsequent treatment would make sense in light of a history that was presented to the grand jury about this is how this particular police officer acted, this is how police officers acted in general with this particular African-American community. And we don't know that any of that has been presented to the grand jury, but it should if they are going to be a fair and impartial grand jury.
Kendall Coffee and Liz Brown, thank you both for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Reverend.
Coming up, for the first time, Monica Lewinsky.